It's a fact that if we stop being the world reserve currency, every single person in America gets significantly poor overnight.
The White House says a decision by OPEC Plus to cut oil production is a clear sign the group is aligning with Russia.
Brazil and China reportedly striking a deal to ditch the U.S. dollar to trade in their own currencies.
India and Russia are all set to begin settling trade using the rupee instead of the dollar.
More than a dozen nations have expressed interest in joining the group.
The dollar has been at the center of the world for the last 100+ years as the world reserve currency. But a group of emerging markets led by the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, otherwise known as BRICS, are doing everything in their power to change that. In this video, let's talk about how BRICS and other emerging markets from around the world are taking action against the dollar, what this means for the US dollar as the world reserve currency going forward, how rumors of a new BRICS currency could play into all this, but most importantly, how this all impacts you. But first, before we talk about what's happening today, let's go back to understand how we even got here in the first place. BRICS was formed in the early 2000s with the original goal of working together to gain a larger voice in the global economy and get a seat at the adult table, forcing other countries to take them more seriously. What started as a pipe dream has become more of a reality because the BRICS countries have seen a meteoric rise in population, economic growth, and diplomatic agenda. And as BRICS' influence continued to grow, their passion and focus for one aligned objective became stronger and more clear. That was to eliminate the need for the US dollar. After the first BRICS summit in 2009, some scoffed at their announcement for the need of a new global reserve currency. I mean, who could blame the scoffing? The US dollar was so powerful at that time and had been the world reserve currency since the early 1900s. It had power through the Great Depression, global wars, and inflation without blinking an eye. And the idea of overtaking the US dollar had been attempted and failed dozens of times before that, including the euro in the early 2000s, the German mark in the 90s, France's new franc currency in the 60s, and the imperial currency of the 1930s. So how do a bunch of emerging BRICS economies come close to even challenging the dominance of the US dollar? The answer is they've been slowly chipping away at this for decades. In 2002, China created the China Foreign Exchange Trade System, which is a platform for interbank trading and settlement of foreign transactions. This allowed China to get rid of foreign transaction fees from the dollar and get rid of the need for the dollar altogether. In the early 2010s, the 5 BRICS countries agreed to currency swaps with each other, which allowed for exchange of currency without using the dollar as the intermediary. And it was every combination you can imagine, including China and Russia, India and China, South Africa and Russia, Brazil and China. The list goes on and on. These agreements were worth hundreds of billions of dollars, or more importantly, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of transactions that no longer include the dollar. In 2014, the BRICS countries founded the New Development Bank, which describes itself as a multilateral development bank established to finance infrastructure and sustainable development projects in emerging markets and developing countries. With this financial institution, BRICS is laying down the framework to build up every corner of the world and then use those emerging economies to partner up with and challenge countries like the United States and, of course, the dollar. In 2015, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which is essentially the gatekeeper to the world reserve currency, approved the Chinese yuan to its basket of world reserve currencies. This was a big win for China and BRICS as they finally got their seat at the adult table, even though by 2016, the Chinese yuan had only about 1% of the world's transactions. Let's fast forward and talk about the BRICS strategy today and how it impacts the US dollar. Some breaking news, BRICS is expanding. 20 or more countries have now applied to BRICS, countries like Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Iran, just to name a few. The 5 BRICS nations plan on discussing possible expansion at their annual summit this summer. Before any official expansions are made, they've been inviting countries from around the world to attend their BRICS meeting. This group of countries is called BRICS Plus. And no, BRICS Plus is not another below average monthly subscription streaming service, but instead it's a group of countries who feel aligned with the BRICS ideology. Countries that include Egypt, Indonesia, and the UAE, who are trying to position themselves with BRICS and away from the US dollar. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has been very passionate about creating a Latin American currency. He said, "We can't keep depending on the US dollar. This new currency would be used for cross-border Latin American transactions instead of using the US dollar." countries in Latin America would still use and keep their domestic currency. He stated that the currency would be called Sur, which means south in Spanish, and that the goal of the currency was to strengthen the region's economic power, lessening the dependence of the United States. On the other side of the world, leaders of 10 Asian countries have agreed to promote their native currencies for cross-border transactions. The 10 countries will reduce settling payments with the US dollar and use their local currencies for transactions. The move will help these countries end their reliance on the dollar and make trading in these currencies faster, cheaper, and easier than with the dollar. For the longest time, African governments created trade barriers to defend their markets from regional competition, making it way more expensive to trade with your next door neighbor than with a country much further away. Recently, these invisible trade barriers have come down with the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The idea of this is to create a single market for goods and services for the 1.3 billion people across Africa and deepening the economic integration of Africa. These trades will be encouraged to use, you guessed it, local currencies. These are just some of the larger examples that have been happening by impactful countries and regions looking to bolster their own economies by using local currencies and ditching the US dollar. What if these countries and regions teamed up and created one singular currency that could be used throughout the entire world? Talks of a new world reserve currency have been heating up by the BRICS leaders. It's an intriguing concept, and even the United States Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell thinks the United States could share the stage with another world reserve currency. There are 3 strengths a country possesses when becoming the world reserve currency: stability, investing juggernaut, and the exclusivity to buying oil. But what happens to those strengths when BRICS and BRICS Plus tries to get in the way? Stability for the world reserve currency is inevitable because countries around the world are using that currency for international trade. But as we've just seen, countries around the world are now opting to use local currencies, foregoing the stability of the US dollar. The economy of the world reserve currency becomes an investing juggernaut, since the idea is countries around the world have to hold your currency for international trade, and right now this is called the dollar wallet. Countries don't use all the money in their dollar wallet and instead invest the rest into US markets. But what happens when countries inevitably hold less US dollars and invest less US dollars back into the United States? Finally, the world reserve currency has the exclusivity to buy oil. Well, at least they used to. Saudi Arabia, one of the largest producers of oil in the world, is now open to the idea of trading oil in other currencies than the US dollar. So how does all this impact the US dollar? Currently, the US dollar makes up over 60% of the world reserve currencies, which is very significant. And in terms of daily transactions, while the dollar does not hold the transactional majority, it has overwhelming control of the transactional share, which is much more important. With the United States' internal problems like the banking crisis, national debt, inflation, and the housing market always being the daily focus, its reserve currency role has certainly taken a backseat. There is a very real danger that other countries see an opportunity and are ready to take advantage. But even though the dollar is being transacted with less than it was a decade ago, and there's more competition, the dollar still has the advantage for now, and that won't change overnight. This is definitely something to keep on your radar, but not something I would panic about quite yet. To stay up to date with what's happening with BRICS and how it relates to the US dollar, make sure to subscribe to the channel. One country I didn't mention once in this whole video, Mexico, could actually have the most significant impact to the United States and the dollar. Find out why in this video here.